All right, here we go. You are joining us in the middle of our Don't Settle series of messages. We're talking about how Jesus has come to bring full life, complete and total. It comes from John chapter 10:10, where Jesus says, "The thief comes to steal and kill and destroy, but I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." And so if you've been with us, you know what all this is about. If not, I'll explain it to you. This life to the full that Jesus offers is not necessarily what we would think of as Americans. It's not a life of I have everything I need in abundance all the time. I have plenty of money, plenty of friends, plenty of health, all of those types of things. But instead, it's a promise from Jesus that no matter what you go through, no matter what season of life you're in, His grace is going to be sufficient to sustain you and to lead you through that season. And so sometimes those are going to be seasons of extreme abundance. And sometimes it's going to be enough grace as He leads you through the valley of the shadow of death. But wherever we land on that spectrum this morning, the message is that He has good news for us. And so what we've been talking about is how Jesus has created us for our lives to be full of His presence and full of His power. But sin comes and disrupts that ability. And sin comes and brings with it, and so we've kind of used these ping pong balls to represent just the different behaviors, the different hurts, the pains that we experience in life, and they begin to fill our life. And so what Jesus does is He comes and He begins to pour His grace into us. And so our job is not to fix ourselves through behavior management, but our job is to surrender to His grace, and as He goes to work in us, He pushes up and pushes out all of those things that have caused us so many issues, so much heartache, and so much grief. And then a couple weeks ago, we talked about this idea of, we're all kind of aware of the surface issues in our life. We're aware of the things on the outside that we want to change, some behaviors. But we talked about how these orange balls remind us that there's always, underneath every behavior, there's a belief. Underneath every sinful action, there's a root of sin that's taken a hold in our heart. And so what Jesus does is He doesn't come and leave us at this halfway point, but He comes to bring complete healing. He comes to bring total forgiveness. He comes to bring absolute transformation, to push up those deepest things, the thing underneath the thing. And what I want to talk to you about this morning for the next few minutes is how our response to the grace of Jesus is to not settle for a wounded life. So for this morning, let's think of it this way. Think of these white balls as the sin, the hurt, the pain that you've experienced in life, and we've all experienced that. And then I want you to think of these orange balls as the underlying wound that causes the pain. Okay, so to do this, we're going to look at 3 passages of Scripture, and I'm actually going to give you some homework for this week. So students, sorry, I know our college students here in finals week, but I promise my homework will be useful. I always, no offense teachers, but be honest, right? If you can't teach it in class, so just kidding. Love you all. So three scriptures for you to read. We're going to reference them this morning, but we don't have time to read them in depth. So the first passage I would encourage you to read is Mark chapter 5, verses 25 through 34. It's a story of the bleeding woman. And so in this story, there is a woman who has been sick for a long time. The scriptures tell us that she has spent all of her money getting treatment from doctors, from specialists, and that at the end of the day, she is worse off than she was at the beginning. She hears that Jesus is coming to her town, and her response is, if I will just go and touch the edge of His clothes, I believe I'll be healed. So she's at this point of total desperation. She's exhausted every other option. Jesus comes, and there's this huge crowd of people that He's working His way through. And this woman sneaks up and somehow is able to reach out and touch just the edge of His clothes. And the scriptures say, as she touched it, Jesus felt the power go out of Him. And so He stopped and He said, "Who touched me?" And His disciples said, "Everyone." Right? You're in the middle of a crowd. What do you mean, who touched you? There's no way to know. And Jesus said, "No, I felt the power go out of me. Who was it?" And this woman kind of meekly comes forward and says, "It was me." And He tells her, "Daughter, go in peace. Your faith has healed you." And she walks away that day completely and totally free of this sickness that had caused her so many issues. The second story that we'll look at is in Mark chapter 9, verses 14 through 29. It's the story of a father who has a son who is possessed by an evil spirit. This evil spirit has tormented this boy since he was young to the point that he has scars all over his body from the times it has thrown him to the ground, that it has caused seizures. The dad says it's tried to throw him in the water to drown him. It's tried to throw him in the fire to burn him. And so this father has come and he's brought his son to the disciples and said, "Can you please drive out this evil spirit?" And they couldn't do it. And so he comes to Jesus and he says, "Hey, Jesus, if you can help me. I've tried everything. Your disciples couldn't drive it out. My son's going to die if you don't intervene. If you can." And Jesus responds to him. He says, "If I can, everything is possible for the one who believes." And the father, I love the dad in this story. I identify so much with him because he says, "I do believe. Help me with my unbelief." Right? It's like, yes, I believe you can, kind of. I believe you can mostly. But in addition to healing my son, Jesus, can you help me with my belief? And Jesus' response is not to say, "Come back when you're serious." It's not to give him a bunch of religious acts to perform, but it's to say, "Bring the boy to me." And with a word, he drives this evil spirit out of the boy, commands it never to come back again. It says the boy collapses like he's dead. To the point that the people around think, well, Jesus got the spirit out, but he killed the boy in the process. Right? Which is not the success story that anyone was wanting that day. And so Jesus reaches down. It says he helps the boy up, stands him on his feet, gives him to his father, and sends him on their way. The last story is a story many of us are familiar with. It's the story of Lazarus. And there are two Lazaruses in Scripture, and so to make this clear, we're talking about dead Lazarus here. Okay? John chapter 11, verses 38 through 34. Lazarus was a dear friend of Jesus. His family were dear friends of Jesus, and Lazarus gets sick. When Lazarus gets sick, Jesus is not far away, and so they send messengers to say, "Lord, the one you love is sick," and Jesus' response is to say, "Okay, I'm going to stay where I am a couple more days." And so he stays there, and in the course of time that Jesus stays where he's teaching, Lazarus dies. And so they send another message to him, "Lazarus is dead," and at that point, Jesus says, "Okay, now I'll go see him." And so Jesus shows up, and Lazarus has two sisters, Martha and Mary, and both of them express, as well as others in the community, this idea of, "Jesus, we're upset you didn't come earlier, because if you have, our friend, our brother, would not be dead." And Jesus enters into this suffering with them, and he weeps over Lazarus' death, and his response is to say, "Take me out to the tomb." And he goes out to the tomb, and he stands at the edge, and he says, "Lazarus, come out," and Lazarus comes out. And he walks out in his grave clothes, and Jesus says, "Take those clothes off of him," and Lazarus literally walks back into life. Now, each of these three stories are stories of Jesus healing wounded people. Right? And our situations we deal with today, you might identify with some of those. Maybe you have a physical sickness, like the bleeding woman. Maybe you have a friend or family member who's tormented by evil, like the father. Maybe you're suffering the effects of death in your life, either literal death of mourning, grieving the loss of someone you love, or maybe it's the death of dreams, maybe it's the death of relationships, maybe it's other kinds of death that have invaded your life. My encouragement to you this morning, though, is no matter what level of woundedness you would admit to, that over the next few moments you would let the Spirit speak to you about Jesus' desire to heal every wound. Don't settle for a life where he just comes and takes the edge off the pain. But continually surrender to the grace and the presence of Jesus to let him reach into the deepest corners of your heart and heal those wounds that are the underlying issues of all of these other problems that you face. In each of these three stories, we see a couple lessons that I think are helpful for us. The first is that we have to admit that we've been wounded. Right? For some of us, there's this idea of if I don't admit it, I don't have to deal with it. Right? And so somebody might come to you and they know part of your story and they say, "Man, how did you endure that kind of an upbringing and that kind of a home? How did you make it through it into the person you are today?" And many of our responses, that didn't affect me. No, I'm fine. I just never really thought about it. Or somebody asks you, how'd you make it through the divorce? Well, I just kind of kept going. Wasn't really a big deal. Or there's the other of just, I refuse to admit that I have any problems. I'm not going to acknowledge my weakness. I'm not going to acknowledge my pain. But what we see in each of these stories is that healing begins with an admission that you're hurting. You're not going to heal until you admit that you're hurt. And as you admit that you're hurt, you begin to open the door to this path of healing that Jesus has laid out for you. The bleeding woman, she obviously had no problem with this admission. She had spent everything that she had. And she comes that day in complete and total desperation. So that's I've just got to reach out. I've just got to touch him. The father, many of us, if we're honest, if that was our child suffering in those ways, many of our responses, we're just not going to talk about that kid anymore. We're going to focus on our others. Like, yeah, the middle one's kind of a screw up, but let me tell you about the oldest. Let me tell you about the baby. We're going to pretend that this doesn't happen, that this never existed. But this father doesn't do that. Instead, he risks the public shame, the public humiliation, and he brings his son, not knowing at what point this spirit might attack him and he might create this massive scene. But he knows there's a wound here that I can't do anything about, and so I've got to go see Jesus. Now, Lazarus could not admit his wound because he was dead. Right? His story, it's pretty sure, it's pretty certain, it's pretty final. What was wrong with Lazarus? Lazarus was dead. But his family, there was a wound there. And the wound the family had was, Jesus, if you just would have come earlier. You could have saved us of this heartache. You could have saved us all of this pain. You could have saved us this whole process. We've seen you open the eyes of the blind. Surely you could have healed this man that you love. Right? And some of us, we've been in that space where we experience pain, we experience hurt, and our response is, Jesus, why couldn't you have done this earlier? Why couldn't you have acted before this sin caused so much damage? Why couldn't you have revealed this issue in my heart before I destroyed this relationship? Why couldn't you have helped me see the early warning signs of the disease instead of waiting till I'm stage 4 and we're not real sure what tomorrow's going to hold? See, the admission of our wound is not just an admission that there's something wrong, but sometimes it is this admission of, God, I'm disappointed in you. God, I'm frustrated with you. God, I thought we had a deal. I thought you loved me and I loved you, so you were going to look out for me, and now I'm dealing with all this junk. See, it's in this admission. And here's the thing, somebody taught me probably 15 years ago. I was going through a messy season of life, dealing with the effects of sin, and it was actually my wife who taught me that lesson. We were praying one night, and I was praying very Christian prayers about this situation. Right? Lord, we mourn the cost of sin. God, we don't understand why this happened. And about halfway through, she stopped me, and she said that the way you pray about this is not the same as the way you talk about it. When you talk about it, you tell me the deep hurt that it's caused. When you talk about it, you tell me the anger that you feel. When you talk about it, you voice the frustration, the doubts, the things you don't understand. And then when you pray, you become this totally different person, as if you're detached from the situation. And so I still remember sitting on our couch in our apartment in Springfield. She said, just pray an honest prayer. And for one of the first times in my life, I said, God, life sucks. I don't like this. I don't know why my body's falling apart. I don't know why my family's falling apart. I don't know why you're doing all of this to me. All I've ever done is try to do good for you, and this is how you're repaying me. And as those words are coming out of my mouth, I'm thinking, oh, he's going to strike me with lightning. But here's the thing my wife helped me understand. The scriptures clearly teach us God knows what's in your heart. He knows what's in it. You think when I said that, he thought, oh, Christopher Vance Dow, I can't believe you'd say it. No. You know what I think God thought? Now we're getting somewhere. Now we're getting past the surface issues, and we're getting down to the core of it. And in the core of it, my problem was I was holding God accountable to a deal he had never made with me. I thought that we had an agreement where I did the right things and he made my life good all the time. And he was starting to teach me, no, it's not about your action, it's about mine. And because your salvation, because your hope, because your peace are rooted in me, these circumstances aren't going to change that. And so you come to this place, and if you want to be healed, you have to admit your wound. The second thing you have to do is you have to acknowledge that you can't heal yourself. The woman, she had this experience. She had exhausted every resource. She was broke, and she was more sick than she'd been before. And when we begin to deal with our wounds, she takes a very Western, modern approach to her problems. I'll use my money, I'll use my resources, I'll use my connections, I'll use my brains, my relationships to fix myself. I'll read the right books, I'll go to the right conferences, I'll talk to the right people. I will take care of this. But listen, if you live long enough, you're going to experience physical, mental, emotional, relational pain that's going to push you past your ability. And in that space, my prayer is that God leads you to a moment of complete desperation like this woman had. You see, we often view this idea of, no, when I'm totally weak, it's bad, I'm vulnerable, but what God's saying is, no, it's in that space that you're finally ready to receive grace, that you're finally ready to receive mercy. So in her desperation, she goes to Jesus. It's the same thing with the Father, with the Son. He's done everything that he can. Right? He's tried different things. He's even brought him to the disciples of Jesus. I mean, man, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, surely if anyone can help you, these men can. They walk with Jesus, and they're powerless. And then he comes to Jesus, and it sounds like Jesus lays a burden on him. Anything is possible for the one who believes. And even there, the Father has to acknowledge his inability and say, help me. Just help me. And eventually you're going to get pushed to that point. Right? That boy bore the scars on his body from the wounds in his heart. And for some of us, we do the same way. There are external signs that something is wrong in your heart. You know, they're physically, I think of a buddy that I had, and he was married and got his wife's name tattooed on him. And she cheated on him about 2 years later. And he had this visible reminder that he saw every single day. Now, yours might not be that, but maybe it's the scars of a childhood trauma. Maybe it's the marks on the walls in your home and the doors in your home from outbursts of anger and fits of rage. Or maybe it's the blemishes on a resume of jobs that did not go as you thought they would. Maybe it's the broken family tree that is no longer as whole as you wished it would be. But all of us at some point, we're gonna come up against this moment of, I hurt and I can't do anything about it. Right? And again, for Lazarus, again, he's just the most dramatic example. What was Lazarus going to do? He was laying there dead, bound up in his grave clothes, sealed behind a stone, completely and totally powerless. And so we acknowledge our weakness. We admit our inability to heal. And then in this process, Jesus is bringing us to the point where we see he brings healing. And as he brings healing, he doesn't just heal and deliver and restore those wounds, but he now invites us, now walk into this new life that I have for you. So the woman is healed, and Jesus tells her, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. And here's the thing. She walks away a healed woman. She's no longer defined by the sickness that had tormented her for so long. To her friends, she was no longer the bleeding woman, the sick neighbor, the sick mama, the sick sister. She was just another healed person. Right? For the boy, he comes. And I want you to just picture this for a moment. He's so tormented, Jesus says to the evil spirit, come out of him and never enter him again. And it says the boy collapses like he's dead. When Jesus goes to work deep in your heart, and he brings healing to wounds that maybe in some cases have been there for decades, when he begins to set you free from addictions that have defined you for years, when he begins to pull you out of a destructive relationship that's been all that you've ever known, there may be a moment in that healing process where this thing is ripped out, but it feels like your heart went with it. Because it's been such a part of your schedule, such a part of your identity, such a part of your conversation, such a part of your prayer, such a part of every single day thinking, am I going to do it again? I don't want to do it again. I did it again. What do I do now? And as Jesus comes and brings freedom, there can be this sense of initial lostness, almost deadness of I don't know what to do. I don't know how to move on. I don't know where to go. But in that space, again, Jesus doesn't leave us. What does he do? He reaches down. He picks the boy up. He sets him on his feet. He gives him to his father and sends him back into a brand new life. And he's going to do the same for us. When we are healed, when we are delivered, when we are restored by the grace of Christ, it's not so that we stay here just kind of wallowing in our misery of, oh, thank God he saved me, but I can't possibly move on from this moment. But he picks us up. He sets us on our feet. He pairs us with other believers. And he says, now get moving in this new life. Lazarus, I love because Jesus goes out and he weeps at the tomb. Right? 3 times in the story it tells us either that Jesus weeps or that his soul is disturbed. And so he feels the pain of that. He feels the weight of that. And he stands outside the tomb and he says, Lazarus, come out. In all the years that I've studied this passage, there's something that's mentioned by almost every scholar, and it fascinates me. They say that when Jesus stands outside Lazarus' tomb, that he has to say Lazarus' name first. Because if he just stands there and says, come out, here come all the dead people. Right? That the power of Christ, and it's this nice little anecdote, and yet there's truth in it. What is it that raises Lazarus from the dead? It's the words of Jesus. Right? And so he addresses him personally. Lazarus, come out. And Lazarus, it says he walks out in his grave clothes. And I think sometimes we have this picture of Lazarus just kind of strolling out. But man, their grave clothes, he would have been bound. Arms to his side, feet together, tightly wound with strips of linen. So when it says he comes out in his grave clothes, it is this little kind of shuffle your way out to the front. And what did the sisters tell Jesus when he said, roll away the tomb? No, Lord, he's been dead 4 days. It stinks. It stinks. He can't walk. This is the picture of resurrection that comes out of that tomb. Right? But what does Jesus say? Get those grave clothes off of him. Right? Restore that man's ability to walk. And they leave the story there, but it's not too much for us to assume. They take the grave clothes off. Somebody quickly finds an outer garment, throw that around Lazarus. Get him back home, give him a bath, give him a meal, and it's time to live. Lazarus didn't go back to the grave every day and lay down on the stone. He went back to work. He went back to his relationships. If he was married, he was restored to his wife. If he was a father, he was restored to his children. He walked in the new life Jesus had for him. See, as you admit your woundedness, as you admit your inability to heal your wounds, Jesus is going to bring healing. But as he brings healing, there is an expectation that you will now walk in this new life he's brought you into. And so it might be a new normal. It might be an unwanted path. It might not be the one you would have charted for yourself. And yet his message is clear. You've been raised to life. Now walk in it. And so we began to walk that path. This morning I want to leave you with three ideas that I think we see in all three of these stories. Right, the first is that Jesus sees your wounds. Whatever you're dealing with this morning, he sees it, and he sees down to the depths of it. So there's no point hiding it. Just like my prayers where Angie finally said, just be honest. That honesty was not for the sake of God. It was not for the sake of her. It was for the sake of my own heart, to recognize in a powerful moment that God sees me, he knows me, and yet he loves me anyway. He sees the anger, he sees the hurt, he sees the frustration, he sees the grief, he sees the addiction, he sees whatever it is you're messing with this morning. And then that second one, he's not going to turn away from it. The response of Jesus to your wounds is not to say, I can't believe you've done that. Or my wife's an emergency room nurse, and so there are people that come in to see her all the time. And whether she's working triage or in trauma, they come in with all sorts of different wounds and issues. Now, if I was in that space and they came in and they pulled back the bandage, my response would be, that's disgusting. You need to see somebody. And I would walk out the door. Angie's response, because she's trained and gifted to do that, is we're going to fix you. We're going to get you better. We're going to get to the thing under the thing, and the doctors and the nurses here, we're going to work to the best of our ability to bring healing and wholeness to you. A lot of times in our woundedness, we think Jesus is going to react how we would react. Man, if I unveil